Now, with coverage you trust, this is 10 News Conference.
Rhode Island-based Deepwater Wind is the first company in the country to win a competitive bid for an offshore energy lease. It secured the rights to develop more than 150,000 acres in the waters between Block Island and Martha's Vineyard in a recent lease sale, achieving a major step towards bringing jobs and energy to the ocean state. Good morning. I'm Bill Rapley. My guest this morning is Jeff Grybowksi, who's the president of Deepwater Wind. Jim Terracani's okay. He's just not here today. Thanks for coming in, Jeff.
Good morning, Bill.
Congratulations. That's a big deal.
Yeah, very big win. Very, very exciting day for us the other day.
$3.7 million for one parcel?
Yeah, technically two parcels. In total, about 256 square miles out in the middle of the ocean. It's an enormous site.
Not quite the middle of the ocean. It's only about 10 miles offshore, right?
Well, no, it's about 15 miles south of the coast, so
yeah.
it's pretty far out there.
And this, though, clearly a huge step towards making a reality this dream that's been going on for a number of years now.
Yeah, today it was an enormous step. It was the first time the federal government has had a competitive auction for offshore wind sites. They've got a plan to have a number of these auctions up and down the East Coast, but Rhode Island was first, and so that was a pretty momentous day. The Secretary of the Interior Department, and that's the agency that really leases that land, made this a top priority of the administration to have this auction happen. So we were thrilled to be the winner, obviously.
And this is a whole new format, a whole new regulatory structure, right? They eliminated the Minerals Management Service.
That's right. So you know, the agency that does this is the same agency that is in charge of oil and gas leases. So we all know about the Gulf of Mexico and the disaster that happened in the Gulf of Mexico a few years ago, the Deepwater Horizon spill, where that oil well blew up and created such environmental havoc. That agency that oversaw that is the same agency that leases offshore sites for offshore wind. So I think they want to move on beyond oil and gas exclusivity. So now they're really pushing offshore wind on the East Coast in particular really hard.
Well, certainly the Obama administration has made a big commitment to making hundreds of thousands of megawatts. They
Absolutely.
Want to, or is it, what's the total they're looking for?
Yeah, 50 gigawatts, and a gigawatt is a lot of power. So this site that we're talking about today probably can fit 2 to 250 turbines, each one of them about 550 feet tall above the ocean floor. So these are enormous structures. And so for the viewers out there who are familiar with the 3 turbines just sitting in the Port of Providence, those are 1.5 megawatt turbines each. The turbines we're talking about are 6 megawatt turbines. So an enormous step up in the amount of power. These turbines will be much bigger.
The propellers on those are how big? Yeah,
those are probably about 100 feet each blade. The blades we're talking about are over 200 feet each. So a much, much bigger structure. And and you can do that in the ocean, right? It would be very difficult to put one of these enormous turbines onshore. We simply don't have the land space in Rhode Island to put a large onshore wind farm. You can do it in the middle of the Midwest. You can do it in the northern mountain areas. But in a densely populated place like Rhode Island, you can't site many turbines. But in the ocean, you can, because there's a lot of room.
And it's being done in Europe?
Yeah. So there are over 1,000 offshore turbines spinning in northern Europe right now. 50
of a similar size and
of a variety of sizes, but right now these larger ones are the turbines that are being installed today in northern Europe. So the United Kingdom has a goal of powering their entire residential sector, so all of the homes in the UK, from offshore wind exclusively over the next 10 years. So they're making huge strides, and their competitors in northern Europe right now, France and Germany, just in the last several years have made huge decisions to push into offshore wind very aggressively. The Germans and the French both get a significant amount of their power from the nuclear side.
Yeah.
And after the Fukushima disaster, a lot of these countries started rethinking their nuclear ambitions. So they've begun shifting more and more into renewable energy, and offshore wind is a huge part of that in northern Europe.
Now, But the Cape Wind development didn't require a lease auction. How'd they get their rights?
The Cape Wind was essentially grandfathered into the prior regulatory regime. They were the first, and they requested a lease from the federal government independently of any kind of auction process. Since Cape Wind went through their process, the federal government has come up with a new system where they're going to competitively auction off these sites.
Now, this wasn't, that's not a whole lot of money, do you think? $3.7 million? Because the project dwarfs that in terms of the finances.
So that's not the only payment we'll be making to the federal government for the site. So the $3.7 million that we will pay was simply the bid bonus that allowed us to win the auction. In addition to that bid bonus, we're going to have to pay rent on the site. And once we actually get up in operation, we'll have to pay a percentage of our revenues to the federal government. So they will charge us essentially a royalty payment. Just like an oil and gas oil well has to pay royalties to the federal government, we will have to pay a percentage of our revenues to the federal government to use the land.
Now, one of the advantages you had going into the bidding, although I understand there was only one other company that even bid against you, right?
There were two other companies in the auction.
Okay.
Yeah.
Is that you have an agreement in place?
Right.
With National Grid or with
no, with the state of Rhode Island. So Deepwater has an agreement in place with the state of Rhode Island where we have committed to putting jobs here in Rhode Island.
Okay, so the state endorsed your bid because
Correct.
you have promised that
That's right.
you'll be at Quonset.
So we have a contract with the state that requires us to do a few things. Number one, it requires us to have a lease in place at Quonset, and we do. Since 2009, we've had 60 plus acres under control at Quonset. And the second part of that is that we're supposed to use that land to base a significant part of our construction facilities, and that's our plan. So for this large project, the plan is to do a significant amount of the construction work at Quonset, and then take those components offshore, off to that site that's probably about 15 miles south of the Rhode Island coast.
What's going to be the cost of the electricity? This has certainly been a sticking point with a lot of the public, that actually this green energy is going to cost more than what we're paying now for electricity.
Right. I think the most direct answer is probably in the low teens. So
that's less than Cape Wind.
Yeah, 13, 14 cent power is probably what we're talking about, significantly lower than the cost of what we've seen for offshore wind to date. Also, by the way, significantly less expensive than solar energy. So right now the state is incentivizing solar projects, and many solar projects right now are charging between 15 and 25 cents per kilowatt hour. So we think long-term offshore wind is going to be significantly less expensive than any other renewable energy source we have.
But what is going to induce National Grid to go ahead and buy more expensive electricity besides the fact it feels good?
Well, I think National Grid and other utilities, not just in Rhode Island, but in Massachusetts and in New York, they all, number one, have commitments to getting increasing percentage of their portfolio from renewable energy. Right now, we have this huge reliance in New England, in particular on natural gas. And the company that operates our grid in New England is quite concerned. It's called ISO New England. They're the operator of the transmission system in the grid in Rhode Island, in New England. They're concerned that we have an reliance on natural gas. So in the winter, when everyone is firing up their home heaters using natural gas, and a majority of our electric system is reliant on natural gas plants, we start to get these constraints, right? There's too much demand for natural gas. That's a real concern from a long-term reliability perspective for our electricity system in Rhode Island and throughout New England. So we need to diversify. We need more than just gas plants. So we need to create more wind. We need to create more solar. None of them are reliant on market prices of natural gas. None of them are reliant on the price of oil or what might be happening to coal, the coal industry in the southeast United States. So
they have a legal obligation to diversify?
That's right. So most states in the Northeast, almost all of them in the Northeast, have a requirement that utilities diversify into renewable energy and that they get a certain percentage of power from renewable energy. And that's based on a number of things. This diversity issue, you don't want to be reliant on one thing, but it's also based on reducing air pollution and carbon emissions. And the more gas we burn, the worse our air gets, and the worse the issue of climate change gets regionally.
We're going to take a short break.
Sure.
We'll be back continuing our discussion with Jeff Grybowski, who's the president of Deepwater Wind. Welcome back to 10 News Conference. I'm speaking this morning with Jeff Grybowski, who is the president of Deepwater Wind, the Rhode Island-based offshore wind farm developer.
That's right.
First in the nation to win a bid from the federal government's new bidding process.
First in the nation.
And so what comes next? You got to put some money together if you're going to. How much is this project going to cost?
Yeah, these projects are pretty expensive. So our full build-out plan, which is about 200 turbines out there in this large area, plus a large transmission system, an undersea transmission system that would link up southern New England and Long Island. That whole build-out is probably about $5 billion.
$5 billion.
For full construction. So we've spent to date somewhere around $50 million on our projects here in Rhode Island since 2009. Our Block Island project, as well as some of the preparatory work for this project that we're talking about today. So it's going to take quite a bit of preparation and lots of work to get there.
You said transmission lines to Long Island as well?
Yeah, so part of our plan for this large site, which really sits there in the middle of the ocean between Massachusetts, Rhode Island, and Long Island, is to link this wind farm not just to Rhode Island, but to Massachusetts and Long Island, because we think that this is a regional energy system. We'll be shipping power, hopefully, to Long Island, to Rhode Island, and to Massachusetts, delivering power throughout the area.
Well, it's not like it's going to make too much power for just Rhode Island. Why couldn't you sell it all to Rhode Island?
Well, I think, Rhode Island is a relatively small market compared to its neighbors, right?
Yeah.
So this is a really big project.
But it's not making more electricity than Rhode Islanders will use, is it?
It's probably more, in total, the project is larger than the amount of power that Rhode Island could take from one project. I think given the size of the state, it's unlikely Rhode Island would take all of the power from this one project because it's just bigger in proportion.
But
so,
I guess what I don't understand then is the whole grid system.
Yeah.
Aren't we all linked up? I mean, we're getting
Absolutely.
electricity that comes out of Quebec now, right?
Yeah. Absolutely, but from the perspective of where the state, where the grid buys its power from, it's unlikely that one state contracts such a large portion of its power from one project. You've got to diversify. So the great thing about this project, though, is that we get to use Quonset and base Quonset for the jobs for this project, but the project is actually serving multiple states. So this is one of those occasions where Rhode Island actually becomes an exporter. Rhode Island is building something here, this project, and we're exporting the power to other states. We get the jobs, the other states get the power, and we'll serve Rhode Island with some of the power as well. But it's one of Rhode Island's unique resources. We've got this outstanding wind resource right off of our coast. We don't have oil here, we don't have coal or natural gas, but we've got wind. And we can build a project that produces that wind and export it to other places.
And it actually is one of the best wind sites in North America.
It's a spectacular wind resource.
Because there's what's it?
Well, you think
because
of the
geography of
exactly.
Of the
think of the U.S. eastern coastline. The wind picks up speed the longer it travels, and the prevailing winds here are from the southwest. So the wind comes up the coastline, and the further up the coastline it gets, the stronger it gets. And it comes up that coast and hits Cape Cod, and we're that last point before Cape Cod where the wind is completely unobstructed all the way up the coast. So it's a very, very strong wind resource here.
So you won the bid, you're going to start hiring people tomorrow?
Yeah, well, you know what, we will start work, but unfortunately much of the work isn't actually, manufacturing work first.
Wall Street work.
Well, no, it's actually in the field work. So we need to send survey vessels out into the ocean and begin surveying the ocean.
You have to do more of that.
We have to do a lot more of that, exactly.
Right.
So we will spend the next few years studying that site. We'll send remotely operated vehicles onto the seafloor to actually look at the seafloor, take images, take samples of the seafloor. We'll send out vessels with very sophisticated sonar to get a better understanding of the wind, the waves, the current, and the ocean geography. And
We'd
that
be-
takes a lot of time.
Would be tied in at all with the folks down at URI
Absolutely.
regarding
So
that sort of...
yeah, there's a lot of expertise here in Rhode Island. This is why Rhode Island is perfectly positioned for this industry. The School of Oceanography is one of the best in the world, and they've been very involved in a number of our projects already. So we'll be tapping into that expertise that we have right here in the Ocean State.
So then how's the timetable look? I mean, you don't need $5 billion before you start, do you?
No, absolutely not. So we're fortunate that we have the backing of some investors that have been long-term in this industry,
Yeah.
and we've got the funds to do all this survey work and all this development work that we need to do over the next few years. I think the permitting and the survey work will take the next couple years, and hopefully I think the earliest we could actually put steel in the water, as we say, put these huge foundations in the ocean floor, would be about 2017. And in order to do that, you need to start work a year or two ahead of time. So 2015, 2016, you actually start doing work on land in order to transfer it offshore.
So in a couple of years, you'll start seeing some activity down at Quonset on this land that you've been leasing all this time.
Yeah, I think that's true, although we're going to see work a little sooner for our first project, the Block Island project, which is the small 5-turbine project that we're building off the southeast corner of Block Island. That's significantly more advanced than this larger project we're talking about. So the Block Island project will see some activity here in Rhode Island next year, probably. And I think it meshes well. By the time the Block Island activity begins to slow down, this larger project will start to pick up.
Very good. We'll take another break. We'll come back. We'll talk a little bit more about that Block Island project and the giant wind project off Rhode Island's coast with Jeff Grybowski with 10 News Conference.
You can watch this program again on our website, turnto10.com. We also have an archive of past programs. Click on Politics.
Back to 10 News Conference. I'm Bill Rapley with Jeff Grybowski. We're talking about offshore wind in Rhode Island, which is now emerging as one of the national leaders in this industry.
We are. I think Rhode Island's at the forefront. There are quite a few states now on the East Coast that are pushing quite hard. New Jersey is at the forefront of this. Maine has been pushing hard, and as obviously Massachusetts has been in this for quite some time. But we've got some real assets here in Rhode Island between Quonset, great wind off our coast, and we are one of the most active companies in the U.S. in the offshore sector, and we're based here in Providence.
What's going on in Maine? They have a pilot project?
Yeah, they've got some projects in Maine. The difficulty with Maine, though, and one of the reasons why Rhode Island has an advantage is, number one, not a lot of people live in Maine.
And they're way up off the major grid.
Yeah, they're not at a big part of the grid. Rhode Island is much closer to big parts of the grid between Massachusetts and Connecticut and Long Island, not too far away. So we've got that advantage. The other advantage is more of a geology issue. Maine, the water's really, really deep. So when you get off the Maine coast, it really drops off fast. Here in southern New England, we've got something called the Outer Continental Shelf, which keeps the water depths relatively shallow. So we get to maybe 100, 150 feet, 15 miles off of our coast. In Maine, it becomes several hundred feet deep very, very quickly. So it's very hard to build in that environment, much easier to build here.
Massachusetts got Cape Wind.
Cape Wind, yep.
And that's a project that kind of rivals your big one, or is it a little smaller than the big one you're talking about?
Yeah, it's somewhere between the size of our big project and the size of our very small project. And that's located in Nantucket Sound. So that's between Cape Cod and Nantucket and Martha's Vineyard in that area, right in the middle of those three land masses.
There was, okay, so, and then you go south, New Jersey's pushing hard.
Yeah.
The next auction's going to be off Virginia, right?
That's right. That's right.
They got some companies down there that are involved?
There's a lot of interest down there as well. I think, again, one of the advantages that we have here is that we, unfortunately, don't have a whole lot of military installations around here anymore. They do in Virginia. So you can imagine the complications you get when you're trying to put an offshore wind farm very close to big naval bases, right? So they've got that complication that I think gives us an advantage. We don't have those types of complications very close to our shore.
Now, you've got Block Island that's a lot farther advanced than the big project. There's only, is it
That's right.
5 turbines?
That's
off
5 turbines off the southeast coast of Block Island, and I know you've been showing some videos from our Block Island project.
Yeah.
That project's much more advanced. We expect to begin work on the onshore part of that project next year, with the turbines spinning in 2015.
Now, the onshore work, you're talking about on Block Island or on the mainland?
So both. So we'll need to build a transmission system that links Block Island to the mainland. So right now, Block Island, there's no electric connection between Block Island and the mainland. So they have their own diesel generators on island, and the diesel comes over on the ferry. They ferry 1 million gallons of diesel oil across Block Island Sound every year to fire up those generators. They're pretty dirty generators. And so the air pollution is pretty significant compared to other power plants in the area. Once we build the project and connect the island to the mainland, we will reduce the air pollution in the area very significantly, really increase air quality. It's a huge advantage, not just for Block Island, but really for all of southern New England.
So have you got a piece of land where you're going to build your transmission out there?
Yeah, so we're going to build a transmission substation on Block Island, and then there will be a submarine cable that will be 6 feet under the mud line in the water, buried in the ocean, and it'll come up north through Block Island Sound and connect with National Grid system here on shore.
Where?
Somewhere in southern Rhode Island. We've got a couple different alternatives that we're working on right now.
And is that cable one of the toughest challenges in getting this offshore wind into the electric system?
I think, being the first project in the U.S., there are lots of challenges, and landing the cable is one of them. Finding the right place to land the cable. The cable gets buried underneath the ocean, and it's buried pretty much the whole way until it gets to a big part of National Grid's existing system where the two systems are married together. But we're working on that, and that's something that's going to get resolved shortly.
Is Deepwater got any other projects in mind in other states?
Yeah, we're about building offshore wind here in the Northeast, and New Jersey is an area that we've been looking at for a number of years. Metropolitan New York, that is the area right off of New York City and the western end of Long Island. I think there's a lot of potential there. So that's our field of operation, really, New Jersey to southern New England. And I think we see long term the opportunity to build several large energy centers offshore that are really close to these big population centers.
And there's a limited number of those.
Absolutely. There's only a handful of sites that the federal government is going to lease out. Now, they're quite large sites, but there are only a handful of them that will be leased. And we'll see how those auctions go. I think we're interested in some of the sites that will be auctioned over the next year or so by the federal government. We think the Rhode Island site is significantly more advanced than the others because of a lot of the work that the state of Rhode Island has done in a planning process. So I think the Rhode Island project is several years ahead of New Jersey and New York.
Right, but you also are actively interested in other projects?
Absolutely, yeah. We're trying to build a business here that extends up and down the East Coast because we do think that offshore wind will be one of the key elements of supplying new power for this densely populated Northeast region.
And all of Rhode Island should be cheering for you in New Jersey and New York as well, because the company's committed to doing as much of its manufacturing at Quonset.
That's right. I mean, whether we're building projects here in New England or somewhere else, it'll mean jobs here for Rhode Island. So there are aspects of these projects that are likely going to happen in Quonset regardless of where the project is located. I think the further away from Quonset the project is, the less jobs you get in Quonset, but they're all going to create jobs here locally.
And we're out of time. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks.
Jeff Grybowski
Thanks,
from Deepwater Wind. I'm Bill Rapley. Thanks for watching 10 News Conference.